Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Kevin Gosztola joins us today, and he provides an account of his experience reporting on the Julian Assange extradition hearing for 4 days at the court in London. And plus, he gives us some more details and insights about the case itself and the people involved. Kevin Gosztola is a journalist and managing editor of Shadowproof. He also produces and co-hosts the excellent weekly podcast with Rania Khalek called Unauthorized Disclosure. Kevin also reported on Chelsea Manning's military trial. We recorded this on February 28th, 2020. Kevin Gosztola is here talking to us from London, friend of the show. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time today, Kevin. I know you're swamped and probably exhausted after this week. So, really, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on Around the Empire.
So, Kevin, you're an international celebrity journalist this week, and your work's been given high praise, well-deserved. Of course, we already knew that you were a top-notch journalist, but I'm glad to see that some others have recognized you. I've also seen you on some live stream panels, Tariq Haddad's new channel, and I'm betting that your work's been cribbed by a lot of corporate media lackeys all over the world. What I am curious about is, I haven't seen you on mainstream media yet, but maybe you have been called by, have any of these billion-dollar corporate media outlets asked you to actually appear on their networks?
I think it's fair to include Sky News in that. They're just not in the United States.
You're on Sky News? Excellent.
I have, we are recording this on February 28th, and in the next couple hours, I'm going to be doing an interview with Sky News Australia. And then I already did one radio interview with someone at Sky News Australia who I'll probably never forget the way he set up the interview for me, because he just came right out and said it. People in this country just hate Julian Assange.
Oh, really?
So I need you to, we're not going to get into why that is. I'm not going to ask you. He didn't ask me to defend Julian Assange, but he just said, I want you to lay out the case so that people can know what's going on. And I appreciated the opportunity to talk to this host about Julian Assange. He had some kind of I think it was like a drive radio show where people in the morning are going to work. This kind of show that they'll have on listening while they're driving to work. And I did an interview for the Up All Night radio show on BBC. The BBC contacted me. I appreciated being included in that. Nobody from the United States that is in the establishment or corporate press has contacted me, though.
Well, that's really great. I didn't know about that because I don't follow UK media or Australian media that much, but I'm really glad to hear, especially the BBC, even if it is overnight. And anyway, that's really good news. So our listeners, I would say that we should assume that all or almost all of them are familiar with the situation, maybe not in detail. It was all this happened during a work week, so they may not have been able to follow the details of what happened. And for anybody who wants to catch up on that, you can see in the show notes, Kevin, first of all, on Twitter, he collected everything into each day 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's a thread that, in real time, you can see what he was observing in detail. So you can go to that. And then he also collected all of those into articles on shadowproof.com, and you'll find all of those linked in the show notes here. And of course, you can find them on Shadowproof if you just want to go straight there to look. So we're not going to go through step by step because you've already got that. But Kevin, what I was hoping is that, as I kind of said to you before, you are our eyes and ears there, and I really want to hear from you kind of like what happened, and what it was like and what you saw and the major points that you thought came out of this and your impressions and that kind of thing. So I'm just kind of open it up. Well, first, maybe we should introduce the main characters for anybody who may not know. We've obviously Julian Assange. This is part one of an extradition hearing for Julian, where the United States is trying to extradite him on a whole range of charges. There's a judge. I remember her first name is Vanessa, but I don't remember her last name.
I've been saying Beretzer. That may not be exactly how we're supposed to pronounce her name, but it looks to me like Beretzer. And as far as I know, from following a couple journalists who are based in the UK and they work with this project that's going to launch in the next week or so after we've had this conversation, they're launching something called Declassified UK. Their names are Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis, and they have done some investigating into the magistrate court and the people who are populating this court who are going to ultimately be involved in the decision making. And that includes Vanessa Beretzer. And they've been trying to tell us who these people are. And Matt points out that we don't have much of a public profile at all on Vanessa, except I think we know that she's fairly new to the court. And so, being somebody who's new, you usually do not want to rock the boat. You don't want to offend people who are your superiors. She answers to the chief magistrate of this court, so she would want to be a steward of this case and probably shepherd it along so that the United States can get Julian Assange.
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, I looked her up. I couldn't find much on her at all.
And
I
you won't find a picture. It's there's not really even a picture out there of her.
I found one thing of what may have been her. If she's maybe in her 40s and blonde hair, is that her?
She's not a blonde hair.
Okay, that wasn't her then. So what does she
Or at
look
least
like
in the
then?
court, at least in the court, she had brown hair, and so if it's the case that she changed her hair color.
Yeah, yeah, that's possible. And is she young, middle-aged, older?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that she's that young. I mean, I think it's fair that she's probably in her 40s would be reasonable to me. Early 40s would be reasonable.
Okay. And then you have the prosecution, the lawyers, and there seems to be only one that does most of the speaking, right?
His name is James Lewis, and he's part of the Crown Prosecution Service. Another detail I can give you, although I don't have much more background at the moment, and I plan to do some kind of a report just so this is out there for people to share in some form. But we were talking amongst ourselves, some of the better journalists that were there to cover this, and realized that James Lewis was involved in the legal team that was fighting against the extradition of Augusto Pinochet,
Uh,
who was, of course, the Chilean dictator.
huh. Fighting
Yeah.
against the extradition of him.
Yeah, and also on the team that was opposite of Baltazar Garzón. And if you understand who that person is, he's a member of Julian Assange's legal team. He's also somebody who has a background in investigating Bush administration torture.
And so tell us a little bit more about him. Is he
So
what does he
James
look like?
Lewis,
What does he seem like?
yeah, he's in his 60, probably early 60s. He I think he wants us to believe he's frail, but he looks healthy to me. But he did complain about having to bend over and speak into the microphone at one point, which
Oh.
is a little comic relief in my opinion, because you could speak into the microphone. I mean, that was a element of this tragedy and farce, was that the audio throughout the whole week
Yeah.
never seemed to quite be figured out until the fourth day, finally on the last day, when we're all going to be done here in the next few hours, and everyone is suddenly figured out how to speak into microphones. We've had plenty of days to yell at them to speak into the microphones. Sorry, I have to say that as much as I am receptive to the defense's arguments, their own attorney his name's Edward Fitzgerald, and we'll get to him, but he had his own problems actually speaking directly into the mic, and so did the judge. The judge would yell at the prosecutor and the defense about speaking in the mic, and she wasn't even close to the mic. So these are the kinds of headaches you were dealing with as a journalist trying to cover and get everything clearly, because you're trying to take notes and follow this and understand. And of course, if they're not speaking into the mic, how can Julian Assange hear what these people are saying in the back of the courtroom? And we'll get into more of those issues later in our conversation. But James Lewis it's fairly straightforward. He doesn't speak in bombastic terms. It's different from the way I've heard this spoken about, because a lot of the way I compare what I'm seeing is to go back to that 2013 trial against Chelsea Manning and to recall the different military prosecutors that were involved, to recall the kind of defense attorneys that were involved there. But here it's he's there's a lot more decorum and politeness, and
Formality, yeah.
and the formality seems to be, and you don't speak with a lot of flair. There's a lot of dry legal argument that you stick to, and so the opening argument allowed for some statements about the accused that gave us the full sense of how the U.S. government feels and the attitude of the U.S. government against Julian Assange. But by and large, James Lewis didn't. I mean, the nature of the prosecution itself is attacking the character. At least what I'm trying to say is that I didn't get the sense when he was speaking that he's just out on some vindictive mission to nail Julian Assange. It's more so that his role is to serve the United States in succeeding in getting Julian to the United States, and he's going to be measured in his effort to do that, and he's the appropriate person to do it because he's very there's nothing that he's doing that seems to be out of bounds, and he's very restrained in the way that he acts within the courtroom.
Now, the setup of the courtroom. Well, I guess we should,
Well, so Edward
Fitzgerald is the main defense lawyer.
Yeah, and then there was also Mark Summers, who was part of another lawyer who delivered argument. Well, both of them. I mean, I think Edward Fitzgerald probably been involved in this kind of work for a long time. Oh, I'll add that Gareth Pierce is in the courtroom, and Gareth has a long history of representing these kinds of people. She had some involvement in the Catherine Gunn case, which is well known. It was just the subject of the film Official Secrets. She was the GCHQ whistleblower who revealed the pressure campaign against UN member countries to turn them into swing votes that could help the Bush administration win approval for the invasion of Iraq. And so she's part of the legal team. And you've got people that like Jen Robinson's the face that goes out and talks to a lot of the press. There's Barry Pollock. There's like a lot of there's a number of lawyers that are in the room that are providing support for Assange, and you know them. And oh, by the way, Kellen Dwyer, I'll go back, is on the prosecutor's team, and I saw him, and we know this person because he's the one who was responsible for accidentally mentioning the sealed indictment and its content in a filing before it was ever disclosed. You might remember that, like back in 2018, there was a story about how it was found in I think it might have been a Russiagate case or something, that there was
oh yeah,
a mention about it. Might have even been Roger Stone, but I don't know exactly. And so this became the story that everyone felt like there was confirmation at that point that the Justice Department was putting together a case against Julian Assange. And we know now that actually the first charge that was brought, the first indictment, was in December 2017, just for people who are curious about how this is all unfolded. Yeah. So there's Edward Fitzgerald, Mark Summers, and and the thing that I will tell you is there seems to be a kind of cordialness between Edward Fitzgerald and James Lewis. Like maybe they see each other often, maybe maybe they are willing to get along and there's an element of the proceedings that you use a certain kind of language that doesn't exist in the US courts. So you'll say things like my learned friend when you really mean to stick the knife in the prosecution and say something that is gonna be a low blow against their argument.
Okay.
But and vice versa, like when the prosecutor means to be combative, he says my learned friend. And so this is like the kind of way that they talk that covers the fact that this is really getting kind of angry. Like this is getting kind of testy. And I've learned that British people in the courtrooms don't really get angry at each other, but you can tell when they've begun to get worked up over an issue. You can tell when the judge feels like she's not getting the kind of respect that she feels she's owed.
And it's mostly in tone of voice kind of thing.
Yeah, like they never really say anything mean. You could kind of tell because the intensity of their speech picks up.
Yeah. I mean, well, they're very well known for being under, for understatements, right? But it
Yep.
almost sounds like the code speak in the South, like bless your heart is an insult. That's like a stab in the back, right? So that kind of
Right.
thing. Yeah. And so what was your impression of Fitzgerald himself, other than the way he spoke? Anything, unusual about him or notable about him?
Well, I think he has a very good strategy for sticking to the law, being very focused and measured in what he says, but also taking the opportunity to work in off the cuff remarks that are going to communicate to the judge what is really happening
Yeah.
to shake her and make her realize that there is a public that is watching. He said something about this he used Alice in Wonderland as a thing to reference the way that
Oh,
yeah, he mentioned that, and that probably carries some cachet within the courtroom to suggest that this is all bizarre and people are trying to figure out why this is happening the way it's unfolding, and that probably gives the judge a quick message that we don't feel like this is completely above board, and you need to realize that everyone here is watching and they may not agree with what you're doing. And I think he's good at also, I don't know that he's the one that includes these specific details, but certainly in standing up there, he's good at delivering this message, which is to make sure that within all of the legal argument, the judge recognizes and has no excuses, recognizes the impact that WikiLeaks has had on the world. So, in talking about these allegations, anytime they were raised, anytime we were talking about documents, he first and foremost, we heard from these attorneys, I think Mark Summers did some of this as well, made certain that the judge was aware of what we were talking about, that these were documents that revealed war crimes. What was the collateral murder video? Well, it was a Reuters journalist that was killed. It was a Good Samaritan trying to rescue people who got killed. And it was the fact that rules of engagement weren't being followed by the U.S. military. Okay, there were these diplomatic cables. There was spying on UN diplomats. He mentioned the cable about Yemen and how the Yemeni government was covering up U.S. drone strikes, saying those were their own. So, giving these examples, talking about the way that human rights organizations have taken advantage. There are a couple cases specifically in the UK where WikiLeaks documents have played a role. I think that they've played some role in helping to combat CIA rendition. Looking, there's something involving, I don't know a whole lot about it, but it involves Chagos and the Chagos Archipelago, and something that the WikiLeaks documents revealed that has been useful to them. So I'm just giving these very quick examples of
no, that's
how
good. That's
the
good.
of how the defense made certain that the judge wasn't just looking at this in terms of crimes, but was understanding that there's been some public benefit to what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks has done.
Yeah, and that's what I thought you were getting at because I mean, a lot of people talk about uh, the espionage charges here in the States. If I'm, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the public good, you're not allowed to use public benefit or the public good as part of your defense. So by bringing this into the extradition hearings, you're getting some of that out in the open, even if you can't technically use it as your defense. I don't know if you can use it in an extradition defense, but certainly you have a real problem with that once you get over here.
You can use it. What they're doing is they're arguing abuse of process and that what the allegations are in the indictment are, as they're alleged, unfair, improper, and inaccurate. And so, uh, it's got to meet a test. And by being so, then you can make allegations that the prosecution has abused process in the way that they've brought the extradition. And they go a step further and say, by doing this, you've put information in and you've created a narrative that gives the judge a sense that Julian Assange is more dangerous than he really is, which in the result is Julian Assange is in a prison when he should be out of jail. And so this is important because there are supposed to be protections against arbitrary detention. So part of their argument is abusing the extradition process in such a way that now Julian Assange has been kept in a jail without bail. And so the public benefit aspect, part of arguing that is to say that the allegations against him erase this aspect of what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did.
Ah, okay, I see. And overall, Kevin, were you impressed by the defense team? Did you feel like they had put together a pretty good case? I know you're not a legal expert, but you have spent, I mean, an enormous amount of time covering in person the Manning trial, and just, I know from experience with you that you're always following the details of these things. So you've definitely gathered some legal expertise here, as a journalist. But in your opinion, what was your impression of the case that they have built to defend Assange in this, kind of crazy situation?
Well, first, I'll just say that as I understand, the defense has the burden to prove that Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States. There's not a whole lot that the prosecution has to do other than to, in a very basic sense, convince the judge that everything they're doing is appropriate. So, what the defense has to do is, and I think they're limited, find a way to show the judge that this is not right, that it should not go forward. And I do believe that they're hitting all the points that you should, because not only are we talking about political offense exceptions, which people can go see my thread to get into more of those details, and maybe that'll come up later in this conversation. But they are also attacking the basic narrative that the prosecutors have put forward. And like I said, they've accused the prosecution of putting forward plainly inaccurate statements about what happened in the chronology of their indictment against Julian Assange. And I think that's crucial because what the prosecutors are struggling with is that they have to show that Julian Assange was a co-conspirator with Chelsea Manning in order for any of this to be believed by a judge. And I don't. I think on the face, if the judge believes that there is anything to what the prosecution is alleging, she probably is going to take this information at face value, this evidence at face value, and then she's going to see whether or not it all falls within her authorities to approve an extradition. So it's up to the defense to poke as many holes and show that what the prosecutors are doing is an abusive process by not giving the judge all the information. And if all the information was given, then it's not likely that Julian Assange would be indicted. Someone like him would probably be allowed to just go about their business and continue to engage in their work and not be a target of this prosecution. And what they have is a tremendous asset because Chelsea Manning delivered a statement in the trial, or sorry, the court martial months before her trial. She pled guilty to some offenses. And in that statement, she has a chronology, which the defense called the best chronology for understanding the events related to this case. And this chronology was Chelsea Manning saying why she disclosed the information she provided to WikiLeaks, why she selected the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, the U.S. diplomatic cables, the Guantanamo detainee files, the collateral murder video, the rules of engagement files, why all of this information was provided to WikiLeaks, how she prepared the documents, how she communicated the information, transferred the information, and there are dates in her statement. So, in order for the prosecution to prove that Julian Assange is recruiting Chelsea Manning to be some kind of insider spy who works on behalf of WikiLeaks, they have to poke holes and prove that Chelsea Manning is lying, or they have to impeach her credibility. They have to go after her. But she's resisting, and the fact that she's been so strong and maintained her grand jury resistance in Alexandria, Virginia, and is still in jail and owes hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines is very vexing, I think, and frustrating to the prosecutor. I could visibly see it while I was watching these court proceedings, and there was a moment when James Lewis referred to Chelsea Manning as a co-conspirator and talked about her giving a self-serving statement, and that basically she's just been consistently trying to advance the causes of Julian Assange. And so even today, while she sits in that jail, the position of this prosecutor who is serving the U.S. government is Chelsea Manning is still answering to WikiLeaks as some kind of pawn of their efforts. As again, our government, the United States government, has built up this organization as this very nefarious outfit. Mike Pompeo refers to it as a non-state hostile intelligence agency. It's not a dissident media organization to them. It's not a new kind of media publisher. It is seen by U.S. government officials as a hostile intelligence agency, and part of that label is probably to justify the kind of countermeasures that have been launched against Assange and the way in which that they've gone to war against WikiLeaks in the past 10 years. But, to me, the defense is doing a pretty good job of addressing this by showing the standards and practices that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks had for the release of information, the care in which they handled the documents, the fact that they have journalists who collaborated with them who will speak up in defense of Assange from Der Spiegel. Andy Worthington was involved in working on the Guantanamo files, and he is probably going to be providing some testimony in the upcoming hearing in May and June. That's helpful. And so I think that the defense is doing a very good job. Oh, I'm back. The defense is doing a very good job.
Yeah, great. And just so people know, during these 4 days of hearings, there were journalists showing up on Twitter saying, basically giving a testimony right there and then. They weren't in the courtroom, but they were in the public social media, at an opportune time, speaking out. And I only saw a couple of them, but I bet there were more who were basically vouching for things like, these WikiLeaks did work to redact and things like that, So I was encouraged by that because I haven't been very encouraged by media coverage in recent years over it, but I was very encouraged by that. So at least some people are doing the right thing, and in my view, they are recognizing the broader implications of this whole thing. Because if they think that that they won't be next, I think that's a foolish assumption to make, because the let's just say the empire, has no problem with throwing out its proxies, throwing them under the bus if it's, if it serves their purpose. But yeah, so let's just go back real quick to like eyes and ears. So each day, this court is a court that is within the Belmarsh prison compound. So what did you have to do to? Well, first of
It's
all, what did you have?
adjacent.
It's adjacent, right? Okay, but
It's
it's
not
still
in the
like,
prison. It's not in the prison. I never saw any part of the prison. I never went through any facilities that were part of the prison. There's a massive complex that was built next to it's this is essentially like a compound. It it's it's not totally unreasonable to say that even though this isn't a military court, that I was entering a kind of military base on a small scale to go cover these proceedings because there's a big security gate that you go through, a checkpoint. There's lots of police patrolling. The courthouse has its own security out there standing. I mean, I don't think they are armed, but they're there doing inspections of vehicles for explosives, which is the same kind of protocol that was followed when journalists were inspected and when others were inspected coming on the Fort Meade base for Chelsea Manning's court martial. So there's a similarity. And the courtroom, like the courthouse, which is in Woolwich, London, is a anti-terrorism courthouse. It is specifically there for processing and hearing those kinds of uh, national security cases. And the Belmarsh prison has a bit of a reputation, and I don't have a lot of capacity to speak about this in detail yet, but it is referred to in many ways as a British Guantanamo
yeah.
because of the fact that it holds people who are accused of terrorism crimes.
So then you get through the security and you have to wait outside, and it's like,
If you're a member of the public, you do.
oh, okay. But you
Yeah.
had press credentials, or how did
The
you?
Well, so the first day was chaos, but that's because it was the first day. And this courthouse was way in over its head. It's never handled a case like this. I'll just put it in terms that they were probably thinking. I don't think that it's every day that an international celebrity defendant goes on trial at this courthouse. They definitely it seemed like this was a first time experience for all working people involved. And so they did the best that they could, but then sometimes what they were doing was just making it worse than it already was. And I did wait outside the security gate for some time before it was finally verified that I could go through, and then I when I got through the gate, we all stood in a line, and the press stood in a line, and the public stood in a line, and then I went up there and I showed my documents, and I got into the courthouse, and we go through a security checkpoint, the metal detector, run everything through, get into the courthouse, and then I had to go get in line to get my card, which was sort of my ticket. So it was something that was going to help me get into the courthouse every day and move around and get into the media annex where I did a lot of my coverage of the Julian Assange proceedings. And it was kind of a mess. It was like, did you get an email back from the court? Or if you didn't get an email, then you're going to have to go on like a wait list and we'll see if we have room for you. We may not have room and you might get turned away on this first day. It was very
Oh,
possible because on that first day there were like somewhere around 60 to 80 journalists from around the world that had traveled there to cover. It thinned out considerably on the second day once people got that, hey, the Julian Assange hearing started today report out of their system, and then they flew back to wherever they came from. But uh, that first day, it was possible that people who were well meaning and thought that they belonged there were going to be denied access. And the courtroom is small. That is correct, that there are a limited number of media seats, and there are also a very limited number of spots for the public to sit, a total of like 16 people. it seems to me that the courthouse should be working out some way to accommodate more of the public to view these proceedings. In the interest of transparency, they should make some kind of a uh, process work so that they could have more people in some kind of a area so that they could at least see a stream of the courtroom proceedings. But they've made it so it's really difficult for people who are from the general public to attend. You have to be there like 3 to 4 hours before the court opens just to get your spot because, like we're saying, only 16 slots. And then if you get a lot in line ahead of people, and there are others in the world of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange who have been there every day who want that seat. Like for example, Craig Murray is going in the public gallery. So like, what if he were to get there and 16 people were ahead? Then you have to haggle, and there's going to be some convincing to let this person sit. And that's happened with some activists giving up their seats willingly so that people who should be in the courtroom can be in the courtroom. But I guess the point I'm making is, why does it have to be this way? Why can't we work on some process so that more people can be accommodated and can view the proceedings?
Yeah, I mean, he's not a dangerous terrorist, so putting him in the counterterrorism court just seems kind of outrageous. And I also read that these extradition hearings are normally held in Westminster, which I assume is, a larger courtroom near the Parliament. But this one was not. So I would
So
guess that Westminster would be able to handle a bigger crowd and is much more used to this kind of thing than this Woolwich court is.
this hearing was moved for two reasons to this Woolwich courthouse because first, it's easier on Julian Assange.
Okay.
He doesn't have to travel, and he has tremendous difficulty with being put in a transport and being taken. And it's not a short ride because just the nature of traffic in the London area can take an hour and a half to 2 hours to get to the Westminster court. And that can be rough on Julian Assange, who we've heard a lot about his deteriorating health. And there's also the fact that this courthouse, as I understand, was better equipped to accommodate all of the journalists who were interested in the proceedings. And I don't quite know how many people from the public can get in versus how many people from the public can get in at the other one. But I don't think that there's much more of a difference, and that wouldn't be unusual to me because a lot of times you'll find in courtrooms when you have these kind of high profile cases that it is the public that gets left out because you'll have seats for the legal teams of the defense, seats for the legal teams of the prosecutor. Well, actually, I will say this. There is a difference in the way that the court is set up from the United States because instead of everyone all being on one level, one floor, you have the well, which is essentially the floor, and you have the defense and the prosecutors down there. And then you have the glass box in the back of the room. The judge is, of course, on the opposite end from Julian Assange. The defense and prosecutor are addressing the judge. And then you've got raised up from the floor the box that would hold the press. And then up higher, almost on like the second floor, but like it is raised up, is
Like
the
a
public
balcony
gallery.
or
It's not, I don't know if you call it the balcony, but like raised up, you have the public gallery. So like they're not on the same level as the defense and prosecutors. They're not sitting behind the defense and prosecutors. So for the most part, for anyone who's been to a U.S. court proceeding, you'll have like the prosecutor will have their people, the defense will have their people, and then behind those people, you'll have the media, and then behind those people, you'll have whatever space is available for the public. They can come in and fill those seats. And all of them sit on the same ground level. And this is different because there are places for everyone that everyone is supposed to be in.
Now, when you're in a whole separate room in the press annex, and then you've got a large video screen in there, and can you see, is it a wide angle camera or is there more than one? Can you see the whole room?
Yeah, I can see the whole room, and I could be in the courtroom, but I'll just tell you that I feel more comfortable in the press annex because I can work in the way that I want to with my computer and sending out the tweets, doing the live tweeting that I do, and it's just more comfortable. And I can talk to people about what's happening in court as it happens. I can react. I can laugh.
Yeah.
I can say something is outrageous. I can there's nobody in there who's leering over our shoulders saying you have to be quiet and stay calm. Whereas there are security guards who, if I said those kinds of things, might suggest I'm being disruptive and tell me I need to leave the court. I certainly don't think that the judge would want me to be
No.
loud like that. So,
No.
but like us there, as certain moments were happening in the proceedings, there were people who we would look at each other and be like, this is crazy. This is
Yeah.
absurd. What is happening? And I think like that helps me. That reaction, being able to have that real time discussion, helps me quickly process and figure out like, oh, I need to push this out quickly to people. As I was hearing arguments from the defense that I thought the people around the world really need to hear, I would talk to, let's say, Nathan Fuller, who is a director of Courage Foundation, which does a lot of the defense campaign work for WikiLeaks. And if he was in agreement that that was a really important part of the defense argument, I'd say, all right, I'm going to sit here and in this thread, I'm going to take a lot of time to focus and make sure I push out specific quotes from this defense attorney. So I like it's just not possible to capture every single line of
No.
the argument that is said in proceedings, but you want to be able to focus and say, these are the parts that people need to hear. These are the parts. And I thought that uh, being in that room, being able to interact with journalists, enabled me to figure out what I should push out to people because there's a lot of weedy legal arguments. There's a lot of discussion of United Kingdom case law, and I just don't really know any of that. And I don't know that anybody else following my work understands that. And I'm not sure that it's going to have much bearing, except for the fact that it's going to convince the judge that the defense, as well as the prosecutor, has grounds to make the arguments that they're making. But I accept those arguments on their face. I don't need to be shown case law to justify it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we are glad that you were in the press annex and not in the courtroom. Can the I want to get to Julian Assange too real quick, but can the media people actually in the courtroom, can they bring their phone, can they tweet, can they use computers and can they, communicate with the outside world, or do they just have to like take paper notes?
No, no, they can have their devices in there. I'd say that the courthouse is actually much more relaxed by comparison to the United States. I've been to plenty of courthouses where they were like, if you have your phone, you're not coming in here, or
Yeah,
if you have
yeah.
your laptop, you're not coming in here. I will say this, that I'm glad that I could come with my laptop and my phone and do the work that I did. I could have done that work from the courtroom, and I'm not saying that during the course of proceedings in May and June that I won't enter that courtroom. One thing that's being lost by being in the media annex is that I can't hear what Julian Assange is saying. He does not have a microphone.
Uh,
His voice can be picked up by the microphone, but he doesn't have a microphone. He's not allowed to speak. I mean, the it the image that they have for free Assange extradition on the banner where they have the flag, it's papered over his mouth, suggesting that he's gagged. Mm, It's in a sensational way true because the judge has told him that he can't speak in the courtroom unless he's giving evidence, which is, to say that if he's going to be speaking on his behalf about something that happened and saying things that could potentially be incriminating, obviously that then opens him up to cross examination from a prosecutor. So, in the event that he wanted to be a witness in his own uh, extradition case, he could do so. But to just stand up and object to proceedings and share comments with the judge expects him to sit down and be quiet. So when he reacts because he can't hear and he's having trouble participating, when he had what, for lack of a better word, I'll call an outburst, but I don't have a negative view of him standing up necessarily. And when that happens, the press are actually fairly close to this glass box and are able to tweet and hear what he's saying. But I can't, in the media annex, pick that up. I will tell you, though, like, I'm getting enough. I think I'm performing enough of a function that if I miss those moments, I can defer to those journalists that are in the courtroom and just push and amplify what they're picking up in there. We're all going to hear. All of the Assange supporters are going to know what he's saying, and you can just spread that around. I don't feel like my work is at a loss for not getting those quotes from Julian Assange, but I do think that, like, understanding the way in which everything is unfolding, the kind of interactions that are, and taking a temperature of the room. Like, at some point I probably will go into the courtroom just so I can get more of the sense of what the atmosphere is like. But watching it, a lot of it translates. I mean, you can definitely tell when there are moments of tension. And you can see the way that, like, there is one thing that I'll bring out that I haven't talked about in any other interview. You can see the way in which the judge and the defense have a bit of gamesmanship going on when it comes to how to manage Julian. So, for example, he wants to sit at the table with them so that he can participate and have his fair trial rights protected.
Yeah.
And she says, and also, like, he's having trouble hearing. He's having trouble following along, and there are precedents in the UK for beyond the fact that, like, to me it's a whole foreign idea to put a defendant in a glass box because we just don't do it
Yeah,
in the United
exactly.
States.
It's like
But
those cages in Egypt.
yeah, exactly. But beyond that, there is precedent that even the prosecutor was acknowledging, and the prosecutor is neutral on this and said it was perfectly fine if Julian Assange wanted to sit with his attorneys. It's the judge that's being hostile and an opponent of something that would be practical for the court proceedings. So there's gamesmanship. And what's going on here is you would say, well, you could pass notes to Julian Assange. And, when he needs to pass notes back to you, I would allow written notes to be passed back to lawyers during the court proceedings. I would offer frequent breaks. And then what would happen is she would point out that Julian Assange just passed a note as if to suggest that you really don't need to have him sit at the table because he
uh,
just successfully handed you a note. And then the defense, and let's say maybe a separate moment, would stand up and go, all right there, don't you see? Julian Assange was trying to get our attention. He's standing right behind us, and we can't see that he was signaling us that he wants our attention. So, Judge, this is why he should sit at our table. And there's this kind of like pushing and pulling going on over, to the like this battle over whether there's difficulty or not, and of course the judge wants to prove that there aren't any difficulties. The defense wants to show that there are a lot of burdens to how this is all unfolding.
yeah, and I mean, from the outside looking in, it's silly. He's clearly a nonviolent man. He's anti-war, if anything, and he's in a counterterrorism courtroom. It's not like he can, like, jump and flee out of the place. I mean, even if he could get out of the room, it's just silly. And we see, the TV shows about even real court. We have seen some real court proceedings have been televised, and you can see the defendant whispering to a lawyer or getting some clarification, whatever. It's an important thing. Plus, it's just the guy's been locked up for years. Just let him sit at the table. I think that is most reasonable people anyway, point of view. And it did come across. And I guess everybody was hoping that even if they didn't achieve the ability for him to get out of that stupid box for this hearing, maybe, over a month's period of time in May, they'll finally let him sit with his lawyers. But and that took up a lot of time, didn't it? I mean, the whole thing.
Well, let me add that was not on the agenda. This is an issue that developed as the proceedings wore on during the week. So we could have had really 3.5 days of proceedings, even though I was informed that it was going to be about five, maybe even there would be a sixth day the following week that we would meet up, because it seemed like there were a lot of issues that had to be managed. This wasn't in my report though, so sorry, this wasn't in my Twitter thread, so I want to just get in here for people who are listening. There's a very good report out there from Justice, this organization. So it's all caps, Justice. They describe themselves as an all-party law reform and human rights organization that is advocating for a more fair justice system in the United Kingdom. They put out a 2015 report on the dock, which we call it a glass box. It's really called the secure dock, but it's a glass cage or a glass box to me. So and I think they refer to it sometimes as such in their reporting. And this is a modern invention. I just want people to understand, because this is going to be a character in the proceedings going forward. It wasn't always the case that the UK had this. It became more common in the 1980s. There actually isn't any law that says courts have to have this. It's just something that became policy in the courts. And I think it happened under the belief that these were needed to prevent escapes or any fleeing or violence from defendants. But I'll read this quote from Justice and then we can move on, which is, research to date suggests that there is a paucity of rigorous data demonstrating that the threat of violence on the part of the defendant or attempts to escape the dock are regular problems. That is to say, there's a lack thereof. Likewise, incidents of public harm towards defendants are rarely known. So there's both no reason to have it to protect the defendant and no reason to have it to keep Julian Assange from being able to escape or, I don't know, hurt someone. Like, he's going to really do that. But there are two security guards there at all times, and there's no reason why they couldn't take up positions in the courtroom and stand nearby him while he's working with his attorneys, while he's following the proceedings. And there's no reason why he can't be out of the glass cage.
Right. And I mean, it would take us a 3-day seminar to go through all the details of the whole body of work of this case. But I do want to mention that Kevin and I had a conversation, I think it was about 9 months ago. I think that was when Chelsea Manning was jailed for refusing to appear before a grand jury. And during that time, Kevin speculated as to, why that was and how it would play out, and gave a lot of details that we hinted at today. But so you may want to, if you're more curious about that, it would definitely be good to go back and listen to that conversation as well. But I'm running out of time here. So we haven't seen Julian for a long time, other than catching glimpses of him. You just, had 4 days where you were able to observe his behavior and maybe assess his condition. So, if you would, just give us your impression. I mean, we've heard some bad things about what has happened to Julian and the impact it has had on him. And I think that, everybody or a lot of people are concerned. What did you get from seeing bride, what he was wearing and his positions and things like that? But I'm curious, just, generally or specifically, whatever you want to do, what are your thoughts on your observations of Julian?
Each morning when he appears in court, he'd go in and oftentimes I think he'd gesture to the public gallery, the people who are there to support him. And I think he raised a fist on one day. I saw him do a salute during another morning. And then he sits down and he's leaning up against this back wall again inside of this glass box. I think he's able to stay engaged for the first hour, but as the day wears on and as he goes through the kind of treatment that he endures each day, it gets taxing for an individual. We heard on the second day that just on Monday alone, he was handcuffed 11 times. He was strip searched somewhere around 2 or 3 times, and he was moved around between 5 different cells or 5 different holding boxes or cells. And so it's disorienting. There's really no way for him to gain any kind of familiarity, to become comfortable with being at the courthouse. So he's being moved around, shuffled around during breaks. These guards are standing nearby. He doesn't trust them. He believes they're probably working for the US government or anything they're overhearing because they're working for Serco and it's a private contractor, that maybe that information might be passed on to others. There are people in the courtroom who are US government representatives. He
Yeah,
said
I
that
want to hear more about that too. Sorry.
one of his when he interrupted court, he said something to the effect that he recognized people who were from the embassy where he had been living for 7 or so years. So the fact that there are people who were likely a part of the pressure campaign to force him out of the Ecuador embassy, that doesn't sit well with him. And then you have the whole issue with Undercover Global, the Spanish security company that was involved in the espionage operation against Julian Assange. And we won't probably get into a lot of detail at this point. There'll be a chance to hear a lot of evidence, and I'm willing to speak to you about that specifically coming up in May and June, because I think it'll be a big part of the defense's case,
I hope
as
so. Yeah.
as they hinted at in these proceedings, because we got some details on the first day from the defense. But he is concerned that anything he says could be picked up by a microphone, and maybe that microphone is recording what audio it picks up. And maybe that's being sent back to someone who is documenting this, and maybe the prosecutors are able to use that information. I don't think it's super absurd for him to feel that way, given the fact that he has been targeted by a similar operation where microphones were planted around the embassy in order to violate attorney-client privileged conversations between his own attorneys, going so far as to target his legal team when they were meeting in the women's bathroom.
Yeah, that's
Again,
crazy.
I repeat for people who don't remember and have not heard about this, that there were microphones put in the women's bathroom so that they could pick up conversations about Julian Assange and what their legal team was doing to protect him. And the example that was given by the defense of how this matters is he obtained diplomatic status in December 2017, and at almost the exact same time, that's when the first indictment came down against Julian Assange for the conspiracy to commit a computer crime. So they feel like there's it's not just a mere coincidence. This is in response to recognizing that Assange was taking a step to put him in a better position to potentially get free of the Ecuador embassy and go to, let's say, Ecuador, to actually leave the UK. I mean, I think diplomatic status might have been an attempt to have some kind of cover to be able to exit the embassy at some point if he wanted, or to give him some extra level of protection against retaliation from the US and the UK governments. So this is not an unreal fear to stand in the courtroom and believe that people are eavesdropping on you and that you might have your rights violated.
Well, yeah, and not only that, years in the embassy and knowing that he was, spied on to the extreme, and now for the past almost a year in a maximum security prison. Yeah, I would think that affects your. Uh, it's not paranoia. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Now, did you feel like he was in? Did you think he was in pain? Did you feel like he was comprehending? I know he was having trouble hearing, so it was probably hard to tell. You know, what did you think of his cognitive um, capabilities, and whether he was in physical pain or anything like that? Because
My best judgment
leaning back could mean that, like, I have chronic pain in my back, and I have to lean back sometimes because of the pain. But go ahead.
my best judgment is that by 1 o'clock or two, he was ready to be done and
Hmm.
wanted to be back in the prison, wanted to be back in his cell because it's just, at least I can be back there. My guess is that he probably has more respect for his fellow prisoners than he does anybody in that courtroom. And I wouldn't be totally stunned to learn that there are days this past week that he was frustrated with his own defense attorneys because he felt like, I know you're trying to help me, but I don't really feel like you're doing it the way that I would do it. Julian Assange was the editor in chief of WikiLeaks, and he was able to make a lot of decisions himself. And we've heard that he had a lot of differences with people who have come and gone in WikiLeaks. So I think we can expect that that kind of tension exists between him and some of his legal team, that sometimes he can be difficult. And sometimes the requests he makes have a good reason and basis, and sometimes they don't. And it's a good thing that there are experts who can ground him and try to help him see that he needs to be more patient. But obviously, this is a man who has gone through this for the last decade, and it is extremely difficult to tell somebody who's been through everything that he's been through that he needs to be more patient. But when he had those moments where he stood up in the courtroom and he was yelling at the judge and he was trying to communicate that this is the problem, this is what I'm talking about, I think that is a very real manifestation of how he is breaking inside, because this has taken such a toll. And he wants to be done with all of this. Like, this is he's reached this point. Like, I don't get the sense that Julian Assange is capable of going through this in the way that Chelsea Manning is able to manage, because Chelsea Manning has been able to, unfortunately and sadly, she's been institutionalized, and she has a lot of history in the past 10 years of being in prisons, of coping and living in a prison. And I mean, I think like 75% of the time that she's been alive, that she was alive from 2010 to 2020, she was in a prison. She was in a jail or a prison. And so it's like, for Julian Assange, he hasn't been in that. And even when he was in the Ecuador embassy, he still didn't answer to guards. He still wasn't strip searched. He still wasn't tossed around. He still wasn't denied a lot that you get denied when you're incarcerated. And I just get the feeling that we're coming up right on a year. I mean, this is the end of February. He was expelled in April, and same goes for Chelsea. But I still feel like it's still bad for her mental health. But if you get my point, I'm saying that Julian Assange is less equipped to deal with it, and then Chelsea Manning knows how to. And so when you're watching Julian Assange, you could see that he's reaching his breaking point every day much more quickly than you might imagine. I mean, I don't think that I don't think it makes him weak to say, all right, I
No,
can't be here anymore. I don't want to sit in this courtroom. But in some days, I think he's just fed up and like, I'd rather just be back in my cell.
but he does seem, yeah, I can understand that for sure. But he does seem cognizant enough to be able to know what what a good defense would be, or, despite the physical difficulties, it seems like there were points, for example, that he thought might have been a better defense or whatever. So, he's still able to defend himself at least in some way, is what it sounds like. And if that is the
He
case, I mean, that's
he wants
encouraging.
to he wants to engage with his attorneys. He wants to be able to respond to what's being said and add insights and
Yeah.
say, all right, let me remind you of something that happened on this date, or let me remind you what I did with this particular document. Let me remind you of this detail because it's just come to me. And then to also be able to ask questions of his attorneys and get feedback so that then he knows that he can have confidence in the fact that his attorneys are putting on the best case.
All right. Well, I mean, that's a little bit encouraging to me, based on it was still just quite uncertain, just, what levels of capabilities he had, or what he's been through. Now, let me just before we wrap up, let me just give you the chance to fill in any other, maybe something else that you might want to point out. Please feel free to do that. But I really need to let you go because you've got got a lot to do. You have to be exhausted. I mean, the amount of stuff you put out just in any given day, Kevin, is amazing. I don't know how you do it.
It's necessary. There's not a whole lot of journalism out there that is covering all the bases and getting to the details that are important and go beyond just the surface court reporting that go beyond things like, hey, the extradition hearing started today. Hey, Julian Assange stood up in the proceedings and demanded to be heard. Or like anybody can do that reporting. You could send your teenage son to go cover the Julian Assange hearing. He just tell him report what he sees happening in the courtroom. But like you need reporting that gives people the context and has a depth to it, so that we can recognize what's at stake in this case. And I think one thing I do want to mention, just so it is on your listeners' radar, is the allegation that was put forward in the courtroom around the Trump administration abusing its pardon power, because I do think that like that's an essential part of the case. And it was also misreported so terribly by the US and Western media in general, because Russiagate mania has poisoned their brains,
Yeah.
that they didn't communicate what was being said in the right way. So to be clear, there was this meeting that happened between former Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher and a right-wing activist named Charles Johnson, who met with Assange in August 2017. And the defense alleges that in exchange for personal assistance to President Trump, uh, and in exchange for giving the Trump administration or Trump himself information related to allegations that Russia was involved in leaking the DNC emails, they would work out some kind of a win-win deal so that Assange could leave the embassy and not face prosecution. And so what the defense argues is that this was using the threat of prosecution as a means of extortion against Julian Assange. Now, what's critical to understand is Julian Assange did not accept this offer. He already had told us before 2017 that it wasn't from Russia. He told us that it did not come from a Russia state actor. So there's that, but then there's also the fact that as a journalist, you can't compromise your sources. You can't give up your confidential sources to the government. You have to be very careful. And I think that they were highly doubtful as to, whether this would actually be a good deal to accept, whether it would be a good faith deal and not come back to haunt them later. And so as it turns out, they're right, because he ended up being indicted and is facing prosecution and extradition under the Trump administration. And the reason why I raise this in the end here is because I think going forward, one of the key things to really dig into about the Assange case is the extent of the politicization of this case. Because the politicization of this case is an aspect that did not exist before the Trump administration. I mean, there's always some politics to cases, but the way in which Donald Trump viewed Ecuador, the way his administration views Ecuador, the way they collectively view WikiLeaks, the way they believe in intelligence agencies intervening around the world, the Mike Pompeo's viewpoint about WikiLeaks being a non-state hostile intelligence agency. You can see that turning against the left-wing government of Ecuador is part of what feeds into this, and they were willing to offer. We've seen a report in Politico about the new intelligence chief, Richard Grenell,
Yeah.
being involved in some capacity in trying to force Julian Assange out of the Ecuador embassy. So there's that political aspect. These officials are just so involved in molding the case in influencing the timeline of events in this case, that it's incredible for anyone to sit and say that he's going to have a non-prejudiced trial in the United States. I just don't think that's possible. I think that the whole entire Justice Department is prejudiced against Julian Assange, and I'm not sure that he could have a fair process. I mean, this is even going beyond the issue of whether you can put a public interest defense on the record. This is even going beyond his First Amendment rights that he should have. This is even going beyond the fact that he's a foreigner who we're trying to prosecute by enforcing our own secrecy laws against a person who is an Australian journalist. And going beyond that, how can the case be allowed to move forward and proceed when the Justice Department is so compromised by this politics?
Yeah, exactly. And he's in the crossfire of a factional war, political war going on in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm definitely going to dig into this whole topic in more detail. It's it's the tip of the iceberg, but it is a really important point. And it does. I mean, Kim.com has weighed in on it, Cassandra Fairbanks, and as you said, the revelations about Grinnell, whether or not Trump ordered these things, and so on and so forth. And it is absurd to believe that he's going to get a fair trial, even on just the basic premise of the Eastern District of Virginia court. But he's in the crossfire. He's holding some valuable evidence that is valuable to two different factions, at least two. There's probably, it probably fractures even more than that. One who thinks that it can exonerate him, and one who thinks it can, hang him. So, yeah.
Also, if I could, as we're wrapping here, I wanted to kind of like pull back and go even further. I want to have even more of let's take this 30,000-foot view of all of this, if we can, in conclusion, because one thing I'm struggling with is there are multiple cases going on right now with this Justice Department that deserve attention, and that we have this, it just shows you the manner in which the Justice Department in the Trump administration is pursuing this war on leaks, pursuing the war on whistleblower, going after people in the same way that Obama did, but in some ways it's actually more aggressive. The rhetoric is even more open and vengeful. And we've had in February alone, not only did we have this extradition hearing kick off, but I won't go into details, but just to give a quick thumbnail, we had Joshua Schultz, who was accused of the Vault 7 materials leak, and likely isn't even the person who was involved in providing the materials, but was accused of it and has gone through abusive treatment in New York, and he was put on trial for that. We've had that trial unfolding. And then coming up in March, we have the trial against an alleged drone whistleblower named Daniel Hale, and he's to go on trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, the same district that Julian Assange will be brought to and put on trial. He's accused of Espionage Act crimes. He's accused of releasing the documents to The Intercept that detailed and mapped out the drone assassination complex, which Jeremy Scahill did reporting around. And so this is all happening in a very tight and concentrated moment in 2020, and the Justice Department is just showing the entire world how much they intend to crack down, not only on people who are trying to inform the public, but also on journalism.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope that the gravity of it, that people are going to think about that. And I am not confident that they are, particularly people who are in the business, and it's really worrisome for me. So hopefully we do see some improvements there. Kevin, um, tell everybody how to support your work. And I just want to reemphasize, none of us like fundraising. We all hate it. But there's never been more important than right now. I mean, it's always important, but we need to get Kevin back to London um, for a long period of time, however long the rest of this extradition hearing. He has shown you the kind of work, the kind of product that he's producing, the kind of insights that he produces, and he's going to have to travel there. He's going to have to, all the daily expenses per diem. If you work for a corporation, they'll have their normal, oh, you get like $50 a day for meals or whatever. But for places like London and New York and Tokyo and things, they give you a much higher per diem because that's how expensive it is. And also, he's got to have lodging for a month and whatever other cost he needs. So, Kevin, what's the best way to do this?
Yeah, and the other thing that I've learned, Joanne, is that you have incidental expenses, like when you've got to change your flight, or you've got to,
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
got to change your, or you end up someplace where you didn't want to be staying, so you get a better hotel or something, and then you have to just, you can't cancel your Airbnb, so you're just out money. I'm giving you a hint at some of the struggle and stress that I've had in the past
Mm.
week, in addition to reporting. But this is just what it's like to be an independent journalist. And but before I tell people what they can do, I want to be very clear. Thank you, Joanne, for all of the support that you've given my work and boosting it and sharing it with people over the last week. But to all of you, everyone who has followed this work, who followed the different ways in which I push this story out, sharing the Twitter threads, sharing the video reports that came after each court day, sharing the reports that I filed late in the night so that people back in the United States could have a detailed analysis of what took place so that they could understand and grasp the gravity of this prosecution of Assange. I thank you all for recognizing the importance of this work. Uh, I can tell you, Joanne, that we have had a great outpouring of support with some donations coming in. We still need more to keep this up. Every little bit is going to give us a sense that we can push on and maintain this kind of work and send me back to London in May and June, just as you said, Joanne. So if at shadowproof.com, you'll be able to see where you can go to support this work. And that's one way you can support what I'm doing. And then, not to compete against your show, Joanne, but I have my own podcast,
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I forgot to mention. Yeah.
Unauthorized Disclosure, which I co-host with Rania Khalek, who's a wonderful journalist based in Lebanon, and you can subscribe to that if you want to support me in that way. I mean, that's certainly another way in which you're enabling me to continue to do this kinds of journalism. So, thank you very much, Joanne. I really appreciated being able to talk with you extensively.
Okay, Kevin. Thank you so much, and have a safe trip back. And take good care. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Kevin Gosztola. Follow Kevin on Twitter at KGOSZTOLA, Gosztola, and find his work at shadowproof.com. Also subscribe to his podcast, Unauthorized Disclosure. Around the Empire podcast, independent media, and your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find this podcast and listen to it in many different ways. You can find it on any mobile podcast app, on the website, aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.